Welcome, Dr. Matthew here, and we're continuing our exploration of the various genres of texts that go into making up the tradition of English literature, indeed literature itself. Today we're turning our attention more towards the text of plays. Yes, a very important text to the tradition of English literature and a very powerful medium. We're going to be examining some of the unique characteristics of the play as a text, and also some discussion, of course, on how we might be able to use plays in our teaching English to speakers of other languages. Plays are a bit tricky, and we're going to hear some great tips from the experts.
We've covered stories in the first part of the course and poems in the second. We are now turning to plays, a really exciting part of literature. Plays are this really interesting cross between spoken performance or language and written language. When you're reading, you're going to notice that plays are structured in a particular way. You have the play itself, of course, but then it's broken down into acts, usually 3, sometimes 4. Some of the older plays even go on to 5 or 6 acts. And then within the act, you're going to find scenes. And each of these scenes is an individual story that's within the larger story. Acts often indicate a change of scenery, not always, but sometimes you'll find that when an act changes, you might change the location as well. So when you're reading, pay attention to all of those direction lines that tell you that you're in a new scene or that you're in a new act. It will tell you something about the story. One really great way to read a play is to actually watch the play as well. And no, it's not cheating. There are some wonderful productions, especially of Shakespeare and of Cyrano de Bergerac, 2 plays we're going to be talking about in this session. And go to your favorite outlet for videos and find one of them. There's some good old classic ones with Orson Welles, or some newer ones with actors such as Kenneth Branagh. So I recommend getting one. You might want to listen along, read along, really hear the language as well as read it. Let's move on and look at our first play. We still read Shakespeare today, hundreds of years after his plays and poems were written. And one of the reasons is the richness of the language and the universality of the themes. Let's take the themes, for example. You'll find jealousy, love, romance, betrayal, all the kinds of themes that you'll find in any piece of modern literature and that really speak to us as modern readers. The second is the richness of the language. You hear references to Shakespeare all day long, whether you know it or not. You'll hear Much Ado About Nothing, which is actually the title of one of his plays. Or you'll hear Romeo, oh Romeo, or All the World's a Stage. All of these phrases taken from his plays are a type of meme or even just a cultural reference that you'll hear all the time. So be on the lookout. Listen in your environment for things that you might recognize from the things we're about to read. If you're familiar with Freud, for example, lots of the themes that we see in Shakespearean plays reappear in Freud in his interpretation of how the human mind works. But Freud came much later than Shakespeare did. So these are things that have been in our history and our psyche for centuries. For the rich themes that we find in Shakespeare, as well as the language, Shakespeare even invented hundreds of words that we still use today. These are the reasons we still read Shakespeare.
Great. Well, in the previous slide and the video from our contributing experts, that issue of Shakespeare and Shakespeare's importance to the whole tradition of English literature was introduced. And it is indeed a really fascinating issue of the extent to which Shakespeare should be given some sort of priority almost when we turn to examine English literature. Well, look, certainly in terms of plays, I don't think any program of English literature could, and indeed should, continue without some acknowledgement of the incredible contribution that Shakespeare made to that genre of plays in English, both historically and certainly still to the current day in the contemporary times. The richness of Shakespeare's language, in particular his imagery, has had an extraordinary effect on the development of modern English. So many of our current idioms can actually be traced back to Shakespeare's writings. And yes, there is that very delicious almost question of the official canon of English literature and the priority that Shakespeare is given within that canon and all of the critical issues that arise from that. But in a sense, is that Shakespeare's fault? I don't think so. Yes, so for me as a teacher, it's very much about the question of priority and exclusion. I don't think Shakespeare should be given absolute priority, but to exclude him from a program on English literature is very much equally, as problematic. Shakespeare's not easy to read, but as a play, we are meant to watch and listen, and to understand that aspect of Shakespeare, I really think is one of the keys to developing a much more pleasurable, almost, understanding of his work.
We're going to be looking at one play in particular of William Shakespeare, of course, a very famous 17th century playwright. I'm sure you've heard of him. The play we're going to look at is A Midsummer Night's Dream, a kind of fantasy world. Look at the title itself. It contains the word dream in it. And in fact, dreams play a really important part of the storyline. You're going to see lots of characters referring to dreams, almost as if the play is done in a kind of dream state. Some really important lines from the character Hippolyta, in fact, which you see on your screen, make direct reference to this type of dream state. Dreams are often used in this play to really explain a lot of the unexplainable. You'll see lots of magical things happen, and the only way the characters can really explain that is by saying it was just a dream. So Shakespeare himself was, of course, interested in dreams and the working of dreams, and we see that in this play. They're used to explain the unexplainable. They're used to create a kind of fairyland. We have characters who are fairies in magical forests. So dreams are really an important explanation for lots of things, including the end of the play when Puck will say to us, if we're offended by the play, remember, it was just a dream. Here's an excerpt of dialogue from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. She lingers my desires, like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue.
4 days will quickly steep themselves in night. 4 nights will quickly dream away the time. And then the moon, like to a silver bow new bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities. I hope you got from that excerpt that the dream state that we're going to be living in when we read this play creates this kind of fantasy world and makes this more of a comedy or a fantasy rather than one of Shakespeare's dramas.
The importance of plays to, in a way, any literary tradition, be it English or any other cultural tradition of literature, cannot be underestimated. If we think about printing books and other documents as still being in the history of civilization a relatively new phenomenon, then the performance aspect of the play in a way stretches back probably to some sort of religious ritual tradition. Yes, it's in a 3D space, it's performative, it combines so many different sensory elements. It's not just the text, obviously. There's the sounds, there's the movement, and so plays as an important part of a literary tradition should be given their sort of detailed analysis, because if we treat plays correctly and not shy away from the difficulty that sometimes they can present, especially to younger students, then I think we can really expand our understanding of a literary tradition in a way that, let's say, a novel or even a poem finds difficulty in doing so. Plays are fantastic. The best advice in some of the material we've seen in this lecture is to actually go and watch the play, ideally in the real time, and if not, well, some video representation of a play is the next best thing. Now, in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other language, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes using plays can be highly rewarding, similarly quite dangerous. Yes, sometimes people don't like that sense of exposure if they are asked to act, in a sense, in a public space amongst their classmates even. And so again, we must really handle the introduction and use of the play in TESOL carefully. Having said that, the right play can be absolutely fantastic in encouraging our students to perhaps practice more speaking. And again, there's no reason why you can't actually ask students to collaborate in the writing of dialogue, a very short play. It's very difficult to write dialogue, and it's quite challenging to students, but there can also be a great sense of team spirit building by introducing this sort of task. Alright, that's just a brief introduction to the genre of plays. We're going to extend that in the coming lectures. Thank you.